I'm Chuck. This is What is the Wheel? And I don't have anything to hold in my hand because I forgot to shoot the intro and I already installed the carburetor. That's right, it's time to install the carburetor on the engine. This is a genuine Mikuni. There's a lot of choices in carburetors. You can go with a larger stock style carburetor. You can go with a Chikuni, the popular Chinese-made knockoff carburetor, which is much less expensive than this Mikuni carburetor. And you can go with a Mikuni flat slide, which is a lot more expensive than this round slide Mikuni is. There are also Tillotson carburetors, which are these little pumper carburetors you typically see on 2-strokes, but they also run them on 4-stroke motors. I like this carburetor a lot. This is the VM26. It means it has a 26mm bore. Some people are going to tell you that it's bigger than 26. It's actually a 28. That is not true. What they're measuring is this outlet side of the carburetor, which is 28mm, but the venturi area in the center of the carb is 26. And you have to have that venturi in order to get, you're trying to create a low pressure area and draw fuel and all that good stuff. So I like this carburetor because it is pass-through. The only thing inside the bore of the carb when the throttle is fully open is the needle. It does not have a choke plate in the way, which the Chikuni carburetor does. This carburetor, instead of using a choke for cold starting, it has this enrichment circuit. And you just pull this out and it allows extra fuel into the circuit for cold starting and make the thing easier to start. You've got your idle mix screw right here. All this does is raise and lower your slide. You have idle mixture screw right here. Those are the only two adjusting screws on the outside of the carburetor. You don't have a main adjustment screw because on the bottom of this carburetor, the bowl, is this plug, and it allows you access to the main jet. So if your main circuit is too lean, you would take this plug out, dump fuel everywhere, and replace this jet. And which this is handy because you only got to take the plug out to get to it. So while you will spill fuel, it's not as nearly as big a pain in the tail as getting the bowl out to get to it. So that's kind of a nice feature. Also, you've got these two lines. This line that runs up to here is a breather for the bowl so that it doesn't develop too much pressure and quit feeding fuel. This line is a drain for the bowl. It's not to drain fuel out, it's in case the fuel level gets too high. Instead of overflowing into the engine, the fuel is going to run out of this line. And the only other port on this is this. This is the intake port, the fitting for fuel. So this is where from your fuel pump or your fuel tank, you're going to go to this line right here. Next up, this. This is a standoff tube or adapter or whatever you want to call it. I said I was going to make one, but this thing was so cheap I could not pass it up. And there's a reason it was cheap, which we're going to get into in a minute when we talk about port matching. It's not a bad looking piece. It seems to be made reasonably well. They have even cross-hatched inside of here to give you a little bit of turbulence at the edge of the flow so that your fuel does not separate and cling to the interior of this tube. And when I talk about it in a minute, it is D-shaped like it should be. The problem is the D is not in the right spot. So we're going to have to do a little port matching to get this to work. We're also going to need a piece of silicone tubing in the correct size to connect this to this. So now let's take a look at port matching so that we can get the best performance, because it's free power. Don't tell anybody. So I'd said several times in the series that I was going to make my own intake manifold. I was probably going to make it out of steel because it was easy to do, and there's a couple of reasons why I decided to go with that standoff tube instead of making my own intake manifold. One of them was making the exhaust manifold right here. After making this, I decided that it was not worth the amount of effort to make one, although it was kind of a fun project. So I decided to look around and see if I could find one to buy, and I found that red one that you've seen. It was like 20 bucks. It was a pretty good deal. The other reason I wanted to make my own was because you can get a harmonic effect using tube length for your intake manifolds, which is why if you've ever seen some old hot rods, they got these crazy looking intake manifolds on them. That is a thing to get effect from the harmonics, the wave action of the air, because basically the air is rushing in through the intake manifold, through the carburetor, the valve closes, it hits the valve, and then the air rushes back. Just like if you slosh water in a sink, you slosh it to one side of the sink, when it hits the other side, it comes back with a reduced force, but you have that wave effect back, and then when it hits the other end of the sink, it comes back again. And so you can, by messing with tube length in your intake manifold, you can create a mild, I hate to even call it supercharging effect, but you can improve the flow by using intake manifold. So I was like, oh man, that's great. So I went and did a bunch of calculations, and this was my first intake manifold design. Would have looked like this, getting effect, first harmonic effect. So here's the carburetor right here, and there's all the way down here, all the way down, here's the motor way over here. So yeah, this is like 22 inches long, and that's not going to work. And so I kept reducing, looking at second order, third order, fourth order. Finally, at fourth order effect, I got down to a 9-inch total length, which is actually from the valve face to the end of the intake manifold, or where the carburetor is. And it wasn't enough effect to be worth the effort of making my manifold. So I just bought one. First, I want to do just a little quick comparison of the stock carburetor versus the Mikuni carburetor. So I measured the bore size of this, actually the Maturi size of this stock carburetor, using a snap gauge, which is a little gauge. These go in and out, and this allows you to measure the interior of a bore that you can't reach with something else. So the Venturi, the bore size at the Venturi on this little carburetor is 15.5 millimeters. And as I said before, the Venturi diameter in this carburetor is 26 millimeters. So when that comes down to area, the area of the Venturi in this Mikuni is 530 square millimeters, which sounds ridiculous, but it's correct, versus the area of the Venturi on the stock carburetor at 188 square millimeters. So this carburetor has 2.8 times the flow area of this carburetor. So you're going to get more performance out of this carburetor than this carburetor. And the next thing we need to worry about is port matching. That is because you want to make sure that the shape of your port, your intake port, that's this part right here, is matched up with the intake port on the motor. Because if you got a lip there, it's going to mess up your flow. So we're going to take care of that. And before we even get into that, if you are running one of these little tiny carburetors, go ahead and take a look at this thing right here. This is the plastic insulator that goes between the carburetor. Stick it on there the right way. Yeah. Nope, that's the outside. There we go. It's going to go in between the carburetor and the block. And it acts as an insulator and a spacer. But you'll note this thing, it is round. So this is the carburetor side. And then here is the port side, and you can see it's the gasket is shaped like the port. You can see how much plastic there is in here. It's like you could probably improve your flow simply by trimming this out to better match the gasket. And then you also want to make sure that the gasket actually matches the port, because I've noticed that some of these gaskets step into the port a little bit, and that's also an issue. And especially if you go with the budget hot rod version, or if you race in some kind of spec class that requires you to use this style carburetor, they do make larger bore versions of this carburetor. You're going to need to make sure that this thing matches that bore. Otherwise, you may as well not even bother putting this on, because you put a big restrictor plate in there. Although, if you ever used to watch NASCAR, they used to have a thing with restrictor plates where they found they could actually get more power from the restrictor plate by using a plate of X length. It acted as almost like a tunnel ram effect, which I guarantee this 1/4-inch piece of plastic is not doing that, especially as small as the hole in it is. I put the gasket on just using a couple of 6mm screws, got it snug, and there, of course it doesn't show up on the camera because it's on the back side, but there is quite a lip pretty much all the way around this except for right in this area right here. Right in the area where my finger is. Let's see, right in this area right here is not bad. So what I'm going to do, what I'm going to try and hopefully will work, is I'm going to take this super sharp X-Acto style knife here, and I'm going to trim this gasket and hopefully not cut my finger off. You can see how much I'm cutting out here. Look at that. So now I've got a much better gasket match to my port on the head, on the block or the head. So I can now use this gasket on my standoff tube, because when I put the standoff tube on here, I can see what's wrong from this end, but I can't see how much the tube, I can see how much the port hangs out into the tube. I can't see how much the tube hangs out into the port. So what I'll do is put this gasket, line it up on here, and then I can make my line and go back and trim this out. Okay, now I've got the gasket on the standoff tube, and you can see right along through here we've got a considerable step in this area. So what I'm going to do is mark this off with something sharp, maybe this thing right here, because it's pretty freaking sharp, and so I can create a little line right there, and then I will take a die grinder and clearance out everywhere that the standoff tube interferes with this gasket. Alright, now we've got it pretty close. Maybe just a tiny little bit more we can get in there. Right up in this area right here, maybe just a little bit, maybe just a little bit right there. But this is pretty close. This is what you're looking for. You're trying to get your port size to the same size as this gasket that you have trimmed out to match the port on the head. Now what we need to do is make sure that this port shape and this port shape line up with each other. So we'll install our standoff on the head and mark out any overlap. Whenever you're doing something like this, make sure that you've got your port plugged up. I've got a paper towel jammed in there tight so that nothing gets into the motor, which is a good idea anyway, especially when you're going through this process like I am, where you work on it about once a week. You don't want anything getting in there. It's springtime, you'll leave for a couple of days, you come back and the dirt daubers will have made a nest inside your motor, which I have had happen to me with a transmission before. So always make sure you plug up all the holes so nothing can get into the engine when you're not working on it. Looking down in there, we can definitely see a little bit of overlap. So I'm going to do the same thing that I did before. I'm just going to take something sharp and scribe that line, and then I'll take the standoff tube off and use a die grinder and grind to that line. And this is what port matching is. It's like, you know, it's a pretty basic thing to do, but it can really, you know, improve your power and improve your flow for nothing, the investment of nothing but time. We can see right here, there's just a little bit of area that needs to be trimmed out of this port. When I had scratched this in the first time, I could not see what I had done, so I used the poor man's favorite Prussian blue, the blue Sharpie, which is great for this kind of stuff, so you can highlight an area like that. Works great. So I'm just going to hit this with a grinder. Like I said, make sure you got something shoved down inside your port so that you're not getting anything into the motor, and make sure you clean this out before you finish putting the motor together. And cleaning it out does not mean jetting high pressure air in there, because that'll just shoot it right past that paper towel into your engine, which is not something you want in your brand new motor, or even in your old raggedy motor. It's pretty good. I got one little spot down on the flat area of the D to take care of, and then I should be finished with this and be able to just bolt it right up. Port matching is complete. Standoff tube is installed, little stainless screws holding it on. Now we need to put on our silicone adapter and the carburetor and the air filter. So I'm going to put this on the carburetor first just because it's a little easier to do than trying to rock this on to this once you've got it onto this. You know, I'm lying. I'm going to put this on this first and then slide this on because this is actually a super tight fit right here. So I'm going to cheat and use this stuff right here, which doesn't look like anything because it's just an industrial bottle, but it's a little bit of rubbing alcohol. I like rubbing alcohol because it makes things slippery. Look how that thing slides right on and off there. Look at that. Whoop. Look at that. Fantastic. Super easy. Makes it easy to get the thing on and off. Get it lined up like you want it. And also, if you need to pull it off, it's super easy to do. But once it evaporates, it'll be stuck on there forever. Back in the day, another industry I used to work in, we used hairspray. And that was great because it was like glue. And so once it dried, the thing was, whatever you glued together with it was permanently installed. So anyway, we're going to stick our carburetor on here next. And we're just going to put it on in this tube right here. And we're going to make sure it's lined up. Then we're going to knock our engine over. We'll make sure it's lined up straight. Your bowl can be off a little bit, but it needs to be pretty close to straight. And then the last thing is to install the air filter. When you put it on, the most important thing is you want to make sure that the label is up so you can read it. Doesn't make you look like a noob. And then you also want to make sure that you put your worm gear in a direction where you can get a driver to it to tighten it up. In the case of this is 43 millimeters. The closest uni filter, if you want to get a uni filter, is the 1.75 inch uni. And it will pop right on here, maybe. Already tightened it up a little bit. It's a little tight. It was a pretty loose fit initially. We just tighten this up. Now, for tightening up these fittings right here, I'm going to use, I could use worm gears, but I'm going to use this stuff right here. This is stainless steel lock wire. Use it for locking bolts and stuff like that if you have to safety wire. And I'm going to basically loop it around here, and I have this fancy little tool that allows me to put tension on the wires and lock them in place. Don't forget to lubricate your uni filter, or if you use any kind of like cotton filter or anything like that, the racy style filters, be sure and lubricate them before you run the machine, because like in the case of this one, this was dry. It was not lubricated, and I've gotten some of the pleated cotton, look like K&N filter. They have also been dry, so be sure and lubricate those, or particularly if you're running your motor in dusty conditions, you're going to wreck it the first time you take it out because you're going to suck that dirt's going to go right through here, because this stuff without any oil in it, these filters are terrible at filtering. With oil in them, they work pretty good. Quite honestly, probably a high quality paper filter is still a little bit better, but it's not nearly as cool looking, so I'm using this. Ta-da! There it is. Carburetor installed and ready to go. It looks racier every day. As always, like, subscribe, ring the bell so you don't have to search around for my semi-erratic content. Please leave a comment, good or bad, and as always, everybody have a great day.